I'm going to tell you a story about risk. That story starts in the mountains with me, surrounded by risk, and it's going to finish here with you and a richer understanding of risk and the pieces of risk. And I think if you take away from this a few key pieces of risk, you can use those to look at the uncertainties that we all face in our everyday lives. The genesis of this story is in the big mountains, where I've spent years trying to dodge risk and manage risk and move people through dangerous places. Over those years, I've had to face things like rockfall and icefall and avalanches and weather. Are we going to spend the night out? Thinking about lightning, are we going to open or close a public highway? Wondering if I should take a big group of people across a dangerous slope or not. All of these questions come to mind, and for years we just dealt with this stuff, and I did this probably 250 days a year for 17 years, until the year 2003. On February 1st, 2003, a large avalanche in Glacier National Park took the lives of 7 high school students from Calgary. It was a really dark day, super dark day for Canada, and in the wake of that, of course, a lot of people's lives were fundamentally changed forever, including mine. I like to think of that as the day I went inside, so to speak, and I took a role with Parks Canada after that. And my job was to figure out and implement better ways to understand and communicate public avalanche risk. For me, it was a really exciting time and a very bizarre time in many ways. I'd spent all that time just living it, just doing it day after day, and thousands and thousands of risk decisions along the way. Should I go left? Should I go right? Do I stop here? Should I space out? Should I use the rope? Should I not? All these questions. And I never really thought much about the theory behind these questions. I was just dealing with it and working on survival, as was everybody I was working with. And then I started reading about it. And I started going to conferences and reading books and reading papers and then writing some papers. And the more I learned about risk, the more exciting it became for me, because I realized that I could explain all the things I'd been doing with these basic concepts. It was almost backwards. I learned the theory after living it for so many years, and it just made so much sense. And of course, it also made sense in my everyday life, because we're all facing challenges and uncertainties all the time. And I started using these concepts of risk a little bit to think about problems or challenges in relationships or with money or business or things that I might be facing on an everyday basis. And I really found it useful. And I'd like to share that with you today. That's what we're going to talk about next. So it all starts with hazard. Avalanche hazard is different from risk. And people always ask, what's the difference between hazard and risk? And the difference is you or me, and whether or not we're exposed to a hazard. Hazards are just out there. They're not part of us. There's hazards in the mountains, there's hazards in business, there's hazards everywhere. But if we're in the room here and not exposed to them, there's no risk to us. So in order to have a risk, you need to have something exposed to it. Risk itself is the probability of loss. And it has a number of components to it. And I like to talk about the probability of loss and the probability of gain, because people wouldn't be taking risks if there wasn't some gain to be had. I wouldn't have been climbing all those mountains and doing all that stuff if there wasn't some superb feeling from reaching the top. Or you wouldn't buy a lottery ticket if you didn't think you might win. So risk is about an equal balance between loss and gain. There's several elements to risk. The first two are probability and consequence. And I like to look at those independent of myself being exposed to those. So take a look at the chance of something happening and what's going to happen if it does. After that, we insert something into the risk. You can see here we've inserted a person into this risk situation. You can insert anything in there. We call it the element at risk. It could be in the environment. Perhaps it's fish habitat. It could be forest. It might be your business. Anything could be at risk. But the key piece is, in order to have risk, something must be at risk. All things that are at risk have the elements of vulnerability and exposure to them. And that's quite important. So if you look at the 4 key pieces of risk, they are probability, consequence, vulnerability, and exposure. And those are the 4 key pieces that you need to remember and apply to your everyday decisions. So let's take a look at each one of those in a little bit more detail. And we'll start with probability. Probability is about chance. And engineers look at it with 2 numbers, 0 and 1. And they can calculate that, and they often give us a very specific definition or description of probability using the numbers. But Most of us don't use numbers. If we can get them, great, but I think in our day-to-day decisions, we're not actually using numbers. We're mostly using things like maybe, possibly, probably. We're always weighing things and trying to make decisions about how much we think something is going to happen. That's more where we live our lives. You think about 0 and 1, or 0% to 100%, they represent certainty. How many things are certain? I know I ask this question all the time of people in the mountains and say, give me an example of something that's certain. It's either not going to happen or it's going to happen for sure, and there's always a blank room. Nobody really says much. One hand goes up, and then we talk for hours about whether it's certain or not. Few things are certain. And if you ask yourself the same question in life, I think we could really say the same thing. Most things live in there, which is the line between 0 and 1. And that's actually uncertainty. And that's where I think we spend most of our time. And you know what I think is really important is to embrace uncertainty as a part of your life. Don't fight it. Don't seek certainty, because you're not going to find it in a lot of places. Just embrace uncertainty. And if you look at risk in this way, I think it's really going to help to just embrace the reality that we often don't know the right approach to things. You can just see in the bottom of that picture there's a big piece of ice, and there's a flat spot underneath that. When I climbed that mountain, we looked up there at that flat spot, and that's where everybody camps on that mountain. And we thought, well, I don't want to camp there. If that piece of ice falls off, we're dead. So instead, we chose to do one long day. We started in the dark and finished in the dark, and we bypassed camping there. And sure enough, a few years later, that piece of ice did fall off in the night, and it killed 6 people and raked the whole campsite off that ice cliff. So that's consequence. And perhaps that's a little bit of an extreme example of consequence, but consequence refers to the idea that if this event actually happens, what's going to happen? It's the impact of the risk. So we think about the chance of something happening, and then we wonder about the impact of this thing. And you know, it could be as simple as, am I going to lose $5 on a lottery ticket? Maybe that's something you can bear. Or are you going to lose $100,000 on an investment? Perhaps that's a little bit different. Are you going to get your heart broken, or are you going to find the love of your life? These are the impacts of risk, and this is the consequence that we really need to think about when we're assessing things. And vulnerability is the next piece. Vulnerability is about your susceptibility to the impacts of the hazard. If you look at that image, you can see a person standing there, and they've got a 200-meter cliff underneath them. They're very vulnerable to the risk right now. If they slip, they're gone. So we can reduce that by changing their vulnerability right away by putting a rope on, and it reduces it right away. A really practical example of vulnerability and how it reduces risk is in driving. If you think about things like seat belts or airbags, these are things that reduce the risk of being injured in a traffic accident. They do not change the likelihood of slipping off the road or the consequences of the accident, but they reduce the risk by reducing your vulnerability. So that's a very good way to reduce risk, and there's good ways of looking at how you can do that. Sometimes the inverse is true with vulnerability as well, especially emotional vulnerability. You know, you put it out there, that's hard to do. That's hard to do, but you know what, it's a high-risk thing to do, but it often bears huge rewards, I think, as many of us would know. And the last piece is exposure. Exposure is the gas pedal of risk. This is how you can accelerate or you can decelerate and decide how much risk you're willing to take. You can decide if you have to go all in, like me standing up here talking to you. There's no partial TED Talk. No, I'm all in. I'm fully committed. Exposure is 100% up here. But sometimes you can adjust your exposure a little bit. You can maybe, in the mountains, I will move to the left of something. I will space out. In an investment, for example, you don't generally pour everything into one place. You disperse it across several areas of investment to spread out your exposure to the risk. It's a good way to manage risk. So let's go back to the mountain and the avalanche story just to try and put all this together. In the picture, there's a black star and there's a red X. The black star is where we were camping. So we took a look up at the campsite and we thought about the risk of actually camping under that ice cliff. And we thought, well, what's the chance of that piece of ice? What's the probability of that thing falling off and getting us? Well, you know what? It's actually quite low. Hundreds of people have camped at that spot for years, and no one's been hit yet. So the chances of it actually coming off on the one night that we choose to sleep there, probably not going to happen. But the consequences are catastrophic. We get mowed over by a couple tons of ice, we're dead. We're dead. And we have no way to reduce our vulnerability. I can't exactly put on a steel suit and anchor myself to the snow. I'm in a tent and a sleeping bag. So, we take a look at exposing ourselves there for an evening. It's just too much for us. We didn't really want to bear that risk. So how do we manage it? Well, we changed our exposure. We decided, let's do one really long day, and instead of spending 8 hours in that spot, let's spend 10 minutes in each direction. And we reduced our risk to an area that we could actually handle. Now, there's consequences to every decision and trade-offs. This is what it looks like from 6,100 meters just before the lights go out. It's going to get dark. But the key pieces of risk are probability, consequence, vulnerability, and exposure. And so tonight or tomorrow or next week or next few days, when you're actually thinking about the next uncertainty you face, because of course you're going to face something, try to think of it like this. Try to imagine it and think, you know what? What's the chance of this thing happening or not? What's the consequence if it does happen? How vulnerable am I to this situation? And how exposed am I? And can you make any adjustments to your vulnerability and your exposure to reduce the risk? And I think if you try that, you might find that a really useful way to look at problems in your life. People always ask, where's the line? People want to know what's acceptable risk, what's tolerable, how much risk is too much. That's a question I can't answer. That's up to every person to decide for themselves, or an organization or a company to decide for themselves. But one thing I will say is that that line is often invisible. It's an invisible risk, and you often don't know you've crossed it until you can look back and see it. So I know for me, I often like to try and put in a little bit of a margin because I don't like taking it right to the edge because the edge is invisible. So risk is not about safety. Risk is not about security. Risk is about chance. Risk is about embracing uncertainty as a critical part of your life and just bringing it into all the things that you think about. Risk is about the chance of success balanced against the cost of loss. I wish you the very best of luck with it. Thank you.